Will Durant said it well. He said the greatest question of our time is not communism versus capitalism. It is not the USSR versus the USA. It is not even East versus West. The greatest question of our time is if man can live without God. And that's the reason that I think the Princeton Evangelical Fellowship has sponsored this lectures, and that's the reason I'm here to try to express to you my perceptions on this subject. One other introductory comment, and then we get into the lecture on hand. There are many, many arenas in which theism and atheism can be addressed. It can be addressed in rigorous philosophical terms. And I can do that. I have done it. I have written on the subject, but I'll tell you what the problem with that is. It ends up pitting one person's philosophical mind against another person's philosophical mind, and it could end up making absolutely no difference in your life at the end of it. In fact, I have read through some of the most poignant philosophical debates and seen both scholars do extremely well. And at the end of it, it has changed nobody's mind. I had the privilege of studying at Cambridge University. Two of the professors under whom I had the privilege of listening to lectures, Dr. John Polkinghorne, one of the greatest quantum physicists of our time, and Stephen Hawking, who holds the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge University, the famed chair once held by Sir Isaac Newton. Both of these men are well recognized in their fields at Cambridge universities. Stephen Hawking is an agnostic, John Polkinghorne a very avowed and a devoted theist. What does that end up proving? It basically ends up proving that there is intellectual material available for both sides on the issue. Am I right? There is intellectual material available for both sides on the issue. And anyone who thinks that he has either avowed it or disavowed it purely for intellectual reasons betrays a prejudice and a lack of understanding of the subject. There have been giants in their thinking capacities who have been skeptics. There have been giants who have been believers and those who are committed to the Christian perspective. So how then am I going to come to you to make it relevant and meaningful so that we can interact on it? Let me give you my understanding of philosophy at 3 levels and tell you what level we will touch. Level number 1 in philosophy, I consider theoretical levels of philosophical thinking. They are categories of logic, of thought. They deal with formal fallacies, informal fallacies. They deal with the classical proofs of the existence of God and the classical arguments against the proofs of the existence of God and so on. So if you take Thomas Aquinas, you will look at the cosmological argument being defended. If you look at David Hume, you will see him attacking the cosmological argument. So you've got here the theoretical level of philosophy. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle dealt at that level of thinking. And somebody has said all of Western philosophy is basically footnotes to Plato. So we can deal with it at a theoretical level. But level 2 is what I call drama, music, novel, and the existential struggle in your imagination. That is level 2. It is most intriguing to me that the moral philosophers of the late 18th century were really the Romantic poets and the writers. If you were to read the Romantic poets in the late 18th century, men like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and so on, it was Coleridge who resisted the liberal theologians coming in from the German vantage point at that time in history, and Coleridge was a poet. Andrew Fletcher once said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. And so when Woody Allen, in a sense, pontificates as a self-styled philosopher, Woody Allen is coming from a kind of a level 2 philosophy, struggling with the arts and the imagination and the existential undeniabilities of life. That's level 2. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to be sure in your thinking that when a teenager, be it 13, 14, 15, or for that matter, even when an 11 or a 12-year-old turns on a television set or listens to a country music song or a rock music song or whatever, you can be sure in your mind there is a philosophy being carried in the process. and a view of life being espoused by the listener. There is philosophy at level 2. Let's not run from it. In fact, maybe the most effective philosophers in the 60s and the 70s were the writers like Sartre and Camus and all of those who took level 2 of philosophy. They were not coming at the hard-nosed questions in the classical categories of thought. They were just coming from the existential angst and the pathos of life itself. That's level 2. Level 3 is when your son or your daughter or a teenager sits across a kitchen table one night and says, "You know, Dad, today when we were in school, we were discussing a moral issue relating to such and such a lifestyle. What do you think about it?" And if the father says, "You know, son, the Bible says from the Apostle Paul's writings in the book of Romans chapter 1 that such and such a lifestyle is wrong," the son is listening to his father and wanting to say, "You know, Dad, when you quote the Bible around this table, it's very effective. But when I quote it at the school, it is completely ineffective." You see what's happening? The father is prescribing a lifestyle at a prescriptive level of level 3. When what the son is really saying is, "I'm not asking you, Dad, what Romans 1 says. I'm asking you why you believe Romans chapter 1. Because while Romans chapter 1 is plausible in our kitchen table, it is not plausible in the high school and university setting. The plausibility structure changes." If you really want to listen to level 3 conversation, turn on any secular talk show host where they're discussing ice cream parlors and human sexuality 5 minutes apart with equal distancing or passion at the same moment. Pure prescriptivism, pure prescriptivism. When I used to teach courses on philosophy and so on, I said this: always remember to argue at level 1, theory, illustrate at level 2, and apply it at level 3. If you don't go in that sequence, you end up with sheer prescriptivism. You prefer A, I may prefer B, and we end up sort of locking ideas on those differences, not knowing how to arbitrate on what is good and what is bad. Now, obviously, we can't do all 3. So what I'm going to do, as was introduced, the social and personal implications, I'm going to come at it from level 2. With that in mind and pattern with which we'll be following, let me give to you a fundamental response that I have entitled, "Why I Am Not an Atheist." And it is basically a point form response to Bertrand Russell's book, "Why I Am Not a Christian." Bertrand Russell wrote that many, of course, in his debate with the Jesuit priest, Father Copleston. I'm not going to deal with the debate. I'm going to just give to you my response on the 4 existential struggles of life for which Russell has no answer, and he in so much admitted it in some of his other essays. Here it is. The question then arises, may we define our terms? Atheism comes from literally the Greek alpha, the negative, and theism, the word theos for God, negative God. There is no God. That's what the word atheism really means. It is not saying I do not think there is a God. It is not even saying I do not believe there is a God. It is affirming the non-existence of God. It affirms a negative. It affirms the non-existence of God. Now, we don't need to take too long into that, because anyone with an introductory course in philosophy recognizes that it is a logical contradiction. How can you affirm a negative in the absolute? It would be like me saying to you, there is no such thing as a white stone with black dots anywhere in all of the galaxies of this universe. The only way I can affirm that is if I have unlimited knowledge of this universe. So to affirm an absolute negative is self-defeating. Because what you are saying is, I have infinite knowledge in order to say to you, there is nobody with infinite knowledge. Atheism as a system is self-defeating. Bertrand Russell recognized that, so he did a quick 2-step on it. He moved to agnosticism. And agnosticism is very easy to defend. All you got to prove is that you don't know. Now you see, Agnosticism actually sounds sophisticated when it comes from the Greek, because the alpha is the negative, gnosko, to know, and one who doesn't know. From the Latin, it sounds much more uncomplimentary, because it literally is a one-on-one equation with being an ignoramus, one who doesn't know. Agnosticism, ignoramus, same idea. Now, let me clarify the point. It is foolish to say, I know that you can't know. That is also self-defeating. But there are many honest agnostics who will say, look, I have honestly studied the subject on hand, and I am convinced with the evidences that I have studied and the philosophical issues that I have wrestled with, I don't believe it is really possible to know with certainty if there is a God. Now that is a different and a respected type of position. I meet many honest agnostics in my travels who will say to me, on the basis of my studies, an honest evaluation of that data on hand, I don't believe it is possible to really affirm the existence of God, and I move along with that type of soft agnosticism. If that is the position we want to address, I'll be glad to do it. If it gets to hard-nosed agnosticism or atheism, we'll be glad to deal with that also in the question session. But my talk today on the existential level, dealing with the soft agnostic who says, I'm open to the evidence, will you help me? One of my professors of philosophy used to tell this classic story about a fellow who woke up one morning and said to his wife, I believe I am dead. And his wife said, you know, that's a strange sense of humor. It's all right, just go on to work and bring the paycheck home type of thing. And sent him on his merry way. But this impression in his mind lingered for far too many hours. Every evening he'd come back and munching on his goodies, on his lazy boy there, would say, you know, I really think I'm dead. Finally, his wife and his children decided he needed help. If he didn't get help, they would need some help. So they sent him along to a team of doctors and psychiatrists, all of whom were trying to help him without success, till one doctor latched on to this idea to try to establish for him empirically that only living people bleed. Only living people bleed. And he was trying to deny that. But they brought all kinds of evidence, overhead projectors, charts, and all the data on hand. Only living people bleed, only living people bleed. Finally, this man, after all of the evidence was weighed in, said, all right, I guess I'm going to have to admit to you that only living people bleed. As soon as he said that, one on the med team of doctors there took a pin and plunged it into this man's veins, and the blood came spurting out, and he looked at it and said, great Scott, I guess dead people bleed too. Do you realize that in many ways that man was really dead? Because from all vantage points of evidence, there was nothing you could bring to get him to change his mind. What about the existential evidence in life? Let me look at 4 outworkings that atheism has to live with. I cannot live with those outworkings. They are existentially unlivable. You see, if atheism is true, ultimately there is no moral law in this universe. If atheism is true, ultimately there is no moral law in this universe. And any moral pronouncement is either utilitarian, pragmatic, subjective, or emotive. It is either utilitarian, pragmatic, subjective, or emotive. There is no moral law reflective in this universe, and anything that deals with good and bad is purely the product of your environment and your culture. And let me unfold this argument and tell you how it works. Listen to the words of Nietzsche, the German philosopher who I think was one of the most honest thinkers of the past century. Listen to what he says in his Madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him then, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another, or is he hiding Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed him to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns, maybe? Are we not perpetually falling backwards and forwards, sidewards and in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and God is dead. He remains dead and we have killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? That which was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we need to invent? Is not this the greatest of deeds, too great for us to handle? Must not we ourselves become God, simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, you know, and whoever shall be born after us for the sake of this deed shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent, and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke and went out. I come too early. My time has not yet come. This tremendous event is still on its way, still traveling, and it has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time even after they have done before they can be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on the same day this madman entered diverse churches, and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Led out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? We have killed him. Anytime I hear a man lambasting or criticizing religion for having caused bloodshed, it is a legitimate criticism, because it is unfortunate. But there is an answer to that. I won't go into the answer to that, but let me just say this. The same people often forget of the bloodshed that has been shed in the name of atheism. Stalin was an avowed atheist. He used to be a seminary student preparing for the ministry when he lost his belief in God, and Lenin singularly selected Stalin because of his hatred of things religious. He read Nietzsche. Adolf Hitler personally presented a copy of Nietzsche's writings to Benito Mussolini. Hitler took Nietzsche's thinking and gave it a kind of a military interpretation. And we tend to forget that the most intelligent nation of the world at that time were the ones who designed the concentration camps, also sat enthralled before the music of Wagner for their entertainment. But Hitler took Nietzsche and translated it into his political theory. The Superman, getting it right out of Nietzsche's writings. But what Nietzsche is pointing out here is, which way are we going to turn? We have wiped away the horizon. Is there any up or down? How are we going to recognize what is right and what is wrong? You must understand, when Aldous Huxley was writing his book Ends and Means, a book that is really worth reading, Aldous Huxley said this, I wanted to believe the Darwinian idea. I chose to believe it, not because I think there was enormous evidence for it, nor because I believed it had the full authority to give interpretation to my origins, but he says in his book Ends and Means, I chose to believe it because it delivered me from trying to find meaning and freed me to my own erotic passions. There is no moral law to which we can reflect. Let me illustrate this in the classic illustration of the Holocaust. At the Nuremberg trials, there was a fascinating dialogue going on all the time on how these judges were going to defend themselves. And basically, the man defending them was in the sum and substance trying to argue for their protection by saying they were operating according to the law of their own land. They were operating according to the law of their own land. Finally, in frustration, somebody said, "But gentlemen, is there not a law above our laws? Is there not a law above our laws?" And the answer of Nietzsche would be no. There is no law above our laws. And if you examine the ramifications of this, you begin to see it in some enormous manifestations, particularly in the Western world today. And I'll say this as kindly as I can. The last 22 years of my life have been spent in the West. The equal amount in the beginning was spent in the East. And Western civilization is being rocked at its foundations because Western man does not know the point of reference for the value system that he wants to espouse right now. See, the Middle East still espouses Islam. There's some transcendental leverage to the culture. The Far East or in India, they've still got some transcendental leverage to the culture. We in modern times are daring the lines in the West, and we actually think we can survive without the espousing of a moral law. History cries out against the experiment. The first struggle that the atheist has is the espousing of a moral law. The second is the problem with no hope. Atheism, basically as a personal philosophy of life, offers no ultimate hope. Death is the end of personal existence as we know it. It is the snuffing out of the center of consciousness within the individual. I think, who was it? Was it Hobbes who said, "When I die, the worms will devour my body and I commit my soul to the great perhaps"? Bertrand Russell himself talked about it as a random collocation of atoms, mindless, without ultimate destiny, and ultimately in the collapse of the universe will bring all of our hopes crashing in disaster and pessimism. So said Bertrand Russell. And yet in the human experience, while Jean-Paul Sartre, by the way, who on his deathbed, not too many people like to talk about it, who on his deathbed, this guru of the 60s in existential philosophy, who became the ideological godfather of the Ankaleo movement, they were all his godchildren ideologically. Sartre himself on his deathbed ultimately said he could not bring himself to believe anymore that this world was existent apart from an ultimate designer in mind. And his mistress standing by his bedside said, "See, he's gone senile." But Sartre had said it. He said death is philosophy's problem. Camus said the same thing. They struggled with the idea of suicide back and forth because of hope that it did not accord to them in their avowed atheistic lifestyles. Now, you know, when death knocks at the door, it is funny how few people I know of who turn to the great philosophers for answers. I have buried a father and a mother, and my mother died fairly early. And I still recall standing by her bedside, seeing her in her last few moments of life. I didn't think of going to some great masterpiece of classical philosophy at that point. The big question I struggled with, and here it is, ladies and gentlemen, you see, life has a singular strength in each individual. Life does not come to you and me in a generic sense. Life comes in a singular sense. That's why we fall in love with a single individual. That's why you get the whole idea of loving your children in a way you probably love them in that singular commitment to that child or to the partner with whom you're wedded. Or the romance where there's that singularity of love. It is just not replaced by another person taking on the generic nature of love itself. And when the person dies, the question has to be raised, is this the terminal point of my relationship with that individual? You see, it's also raised in terms of philosophy. If death is the end of everything that we know, what does that make of justice, which is not carried out in our courts of law? What does that make of any ultimate sense of right and wrong? I do recall talking to parents very often in my travels, whether it be somebody of a very sophisticated background intellectually, or somebody who is just asking the simple questions of life. You can watch how Hindus observe their funerals. You can watch how Muslims observe their funerals, how Buddhists observe their funerals, and you look across the landscape of humanity with hundreds of millions trying to establish the rites of passage. What about this whole issue of what happens to a human being when he or she dies? The issue of a moral law, the issue of a loss of hope. Thirdly, without God, there is a complete loss of meaning. There is no point of reference that defines what the meaning of life is all about. Whether you see the parable of the myth of Sisyphus, rolling up the stones as it were up the mountain only to roll it down again, and that repetitive, meaningless event goes on and on and on. And there's a fascinating philosophical response to how they deal with this. Do you know, in the scientific world, when they deal with the second law of thermodynamics, that things left to themselves move to entropy, to heat, death, you see the whole idea that things don't move from disorder to order. They move from order to disorder. And when you see how biological evolution is defended, they defend it by saying that the biological parts moved against the entropic stream. That what applied to the whole did not apply to the parts. That's what they tell you. Now in meaning, they reverse the whole thing. In meaning, they tell you life ultimately has no meaning. It doesn't apply to the whole, but it does apply to the parts. Give your day-to-day activity tiny little meanings so that there are punctuated meanings under an arching overall meaninglessness. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Give your day-to-day activities meanings. Roll the stone up, because maybe when you get it to the top of the mountain, you can build a building. But then what? Don't ask then what. The building itself is meaningful. And so tiny little purposes with no ultimate purpose, tiny little meanings with no ultimate meanings. How do we find meaning? Can I give you two personal illustrations, if you'll allow me to, and then move to my final thought here? Do you know, as a father, you learn a few things about life that you never learn as a scholar. Because I've found that the scholarly world becomes a very safe escape from some of the real struggles that are bothering you inside and troubling your family. It is the easiest thing in the world to happen. I've seen it happen time and time again. And the sooner we learn that in academic circles, the more real we will become. And my 3 children have forced me to be more real at home as I've talked to them than sometimes we tend to be in writing of our books and our lectureships and so on. My oldest daughter just went through a horrendous experience in her young 16th year of life. And the last month has been one of me as a father trying to help her cope with this and watch her struggle and bear under the load of this painful experience she's just gone through. She had a friend of hers in class. He was a computer partner for her, and very kind, very friendly, very nice to her. Every time she'd come back and say, "This fellow's such a fine fellow, Daddy, always so friendly, always being kind to any new student who comes in," and so on. Well, within the last month, something tragic happened. That young boy, 16 years old, didn't show up in school one day. We make our home in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where this story took place. And the police came to the school, said they were looking for him because he'd run away from home, and everybody was shocked at this story. Finally, they said they would try to track him down. The principal started working on it and so on. Next day, 3 students in his class got a telephone call from him saying, "I want to see you in a private setting. Don't you dare tell anybody you're coming." So one teacher and I think about 2 or 3 students went to see him, supposedly without telling anyone. They were in a secluded setting, a highly wooded area, and they were waiting for him. All of a sudden comes a sleek Volvo with tinted glass windows and so on, and they knew immediately that the car was a stolen car in which he was pulling up. As they walked towards him, he rolled down a window. They saw 2 handguns on his lap, a rifle by his side. They all immediately got nervous, not knowing what they were dealing with. Suddenly, they saw a chopper above them and about 14 police cars and a SWAT team closing in on him. It ensued in a chase, several accidents, finally trapped the 16-year-old fellow. He was at the hub of a major crack ring in Atlanta. 16 years old. They got him, put him into a detention center. That was Thursday. Sunday morning, the principal went to visit him to find out he'd hanged himself. And I won't give you the details of what brought it about, but the wrong-headedness and the confusion and the emptiness in the teenage world is at an all-time high. You can be sure secularism has not given them any answers. It is at an all-time high. In fact, the recent study of the educational process has revealed that 2/3 of our teenagers are basically unteachable, not because they don't have their minds intact, but because they are so preoccupied with the fears in their home and their struggles in their personal lives that when they come to school, their minds are not thinking about the studies that are on hand. They are torn up about what's going on in the home. Did you follow that? 2/3 of them are unteachable, not because they don't have the mental capacities, but their minds are just so preoccupied with the fears and worries with which they live. How is contemporary man going to respond to this? How is he going to respond to the emptiness and loss of meaning? Lee Iacocca said this in his book Straight Talk. As I start the twilight years of my life, I try to look back and figure out what it was all about. I'm still not sure what is meant by good fortune and success. I know fame and power are for the birds. But then life suddenly comes into focus, and he gives us 3 or 4 lines on what has helped him. Let me move to my personal illustration to sustain that, and then my final thought here. When our second little girl, Naomi, was barely 2, I had been away for 5 weeks. I think I'd been preaching in one of the, either Cambodia, Vietnam, somewhere there, just shortly before it fell. And I came back home, and she was in my in-laws' place, tiny little baby, just a little more than that, I guess, just trying to learn to walk in a walker. And as I walked into the house, she was there in her walker. My wife brought me in. I looked at her for about 30 seconds, and we got into a bit of a staring contest. She stared at me. I stared back at her. I think for a moment she was wondering who I was. I'd been gone for 5 weeks. Suddenly her arms shot out. I knelt down, picked her up, and wrapped my arms around her as she nestled on my shoulder for about a minute or so. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say this to you without apology. In that 1 minute, I had more intimations on the meaning of life than all the books in philosophy I have ever read. Bertrand Russell said this: one of the greatest longings of his life, which was never achieved, was the longing for love. And I challenge you to bear these questions at the back of your mind. But Lee Iacocca said this: but then life suddenly comes into focus. There stand my kids, and I love them, and they love me. And maybe that's what life is all about. So he says. If you observe the expressions of the people just released in Lebanon from those who held them hostage, if you go back to the days of Desert Storm, where some of our fellows and girls were held prisoner, what are the messages that were coming back? And I spoke to many POWs during the Vietnam War, some of the Viet Cong prisoners of war in South Vietnam. You listen to what they're saying. They're really not, when you talk to somebody in that situation, they don't talk about a car. They don't talk about a comfort of all that they possessed. It is generally to give love to a husband, to a wife, to a brother, a sister, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter. Ladies and gentlemen, here's my thought. Is it possible that there is a clue to meaning in life found in relationships? It is relationships that ultimately give us a clue to meaning in life. And I leave that thought with you as I move to my final. But without God, there is no law. Without God, there is no hope. Without God, there is no meaning. And without God, if the atheist has taken his stance and said there is no God, and he turns out to be wrong, and he turns out to be wrong when he dies and finds out there is a God, an atheist has made a kind of a commitment that is so unreasonable because there is no recovery. Bertrand Russell was asked, what will you say If when you die, you do stand face to face with God, what will be your explanation to him? Russell says very plainly, I'll tell him you didn't give me enough evidence. Interesting answer. You didn't give me enough evidence. And how that was countered was even more interesting. But listen to what Pascal said, this great philosopher-scientist who died at the age of 39, the father of the modern computer, the inventor of the barometer. Pascal, in his Pensées, where he talked so much about the things of God and the soul, he said this: should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false. Let me repeat that, because this is often misunderstood when people talk about the Pascalian wager. Should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false. Pascal's argument is purely existential, and we must understand that. Because you see, if a person believes in Christ to be who Christ claimed he was, and this person turns out to be wrong, and at the end of his life he becomes nothing, and the random qualification of atoms disintegrates into dust there, as it were, do you realize he has lost nothing? Because the existential pursuit was still contentment and happiness, and he found it. The argument is purely existential. It is not a kind of a stupid idea saying, I'm going this route because I've basically got nothing to lose. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the alternative offer is, if you deny God, authenticate yourself, be your own person, find your fulfillment. Well, the Christian counters by saying, I found it. I found it, albeit in believing something that wasn't so. But at the end of it, no regrets, because dust doesn't regret. I think Aristotle gave us a perfect definition of what nothing is. He said nothing is that which rocks dream about. And that's what Pascal is saying here. If at the end I become nothing, basically had nothing to lose in the process too. But with God, you deal with these four issues. Without him, no absolute moral law, no ultimate hope, no point of reference for meaning, and if it is wrong, turns out to be no recovery. Let me read for you two quotations as I end this talk. I've struggled through it. I hope it is at least put together in some sensible form for you. Here it is. Steve Turner, the English journalist, making some rather sarcastic remarks about the fact that we've hurled everything out so that we don't know what's right and what is wrong anymore. And here's a journalist writing in a secular paper talking about the fact that we've got nothing to refer to in right and wrong, meaning and so on. So he says, here is the creed for the modern thinker. We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone, to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that sodomy is okay. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything's getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think basically his good morals were really bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes nothing. Here's a nice one. We believe that after death comes nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all except perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, and what's normal is good. That's a salvation by survey syndrome, you know. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions, and conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth except the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he puts this postscript: if chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. That's exactly what I've said here. Contrast it with this written by Hardy Shaw in his shell hole in Vietnam. Lord God, I have never spoken to you, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken time to see the things you made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'll take my hand. Somehow I feel that you'll understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure glad, God, I met you today. I guess 0 hour will soon be here, but I'm not afraid since I know you're near. The signal, well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots, I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'd wait at your door. Look, I'm crying, I'm shedding tears. I'll have to go now, God, goodbye. Strange now since I met you, I'm not afraid to die. Those are the words of Hardy Shaw. Two completely different perspectives. Without God, there's no moral law, no hope, no existential meaning, and if he's wrong, there's no recovery. With God, you have all those